Good morning, ladies and gents and colleagues. It's about 2 minutes before we start, so we're just admitting all the people. At the moment, you can relax, and we're going to start in 2 minutes from now. It's 2 to 9. Morning, Frikkie. Just looking at the people waving. Good morning, Mias. If you wave, say morning. It's good to see so many familiar faces and delegates from the previous day here again this morning. Good morning, everybody, all the colleagues and friends and supervisors and examiners and delegates from earlier the week. It's good to see so many familiar names and faces here. It's the last day of the seminar series of SABSA. If you allow me a few words of introduction before we kick off the program of the morning. We just want to specifically thank SABSA for arranging and organizing this event. It was initiatives among all 22 members of SABSA that started with a discussion a while ago, and since thereafter it was brought to task, and here we are this morning. So on behalf of the chair of SABSA, Prof Jonas Randall, a heartfelt welcome here this morning, and also the general manager, Anne Wilson. Anne is with us here. It's really a great initiative, and we are proud as Da Vinci to host it with SABSA and have all the delegates in here. And similar to the other sessions, we look forward to a lot of interaction, practical sessions, sharing some thoughts, important as we share our experience here to also co-create and help each other in how we need to argue and think about supervision. So this seminars is specifically there for supervisors and examiners, and not just new supervisors, but also seasoned supervisors. And hence, if you have any questions or you have any input, please feel free to post that in the chat, and we can take it from there. The sessions we hosted earlier the week, we started off on Tuesday and Wednesday with the MBA focus. Those recordings and slides, some of the slides are available on the SABSA website. You're welcome to go and have a look and download that. Yesterday we had a PhD session, and then today we have both track combines, having the PhD and the MBA, and we will specifically talk about the supervisors, their roles and responsibilities, about the research design and research methodology, and also about the examination process, at which we will conclude the session around about 12. So we only have 3 presenters here this morning, and normally at this stage I would look in the direction and welcome the new facilitator, the next facilitator. Now what's a bit awkward, it's myself, so I'm just going to say I will take you through the first session. You could look at my bio in the invite, so I'm not necessarily going to repeat that. Maybe something that's not in there that I think I can or must share with you. I'm specifically excited about the opportunity here to have this discussion. I think it's the first where all the business schools came together and we have this open debate and sharing knowledge. And I truly hope that from here we'll have many more sessions. And at the end, when we wrap it up, we will say a little bit more about that. If you want to get to know me better, drop me an email, phone me. We can take the discussion there. But over and above to that, I'm not going to say much more about myself. I've been speaking quite a bit. And then this morning, I can't sit back and enjoy the sessions and have coffee as I did so far the week, because the first hour it's my responsibility to take you through. So I've got 2 screens. I'm going to start sharing my screen here just to make sure that you can see the screen. And while I'm doing that, I will also, as a moderator, then monitor the chat. So please feel free to drop a message in there and I facilitate that. You're welcome to raise your hand and we can take it from there.
Prof HB, you just muted.
Thank you, Rian. It's a beauty. So yes, I forgot to say, everybody have the same rights. So you can unmute yourself, you can interrupt. And as you just saw, you can also mute other participants if you really want to. So yes, we're going to talk about, I think, bringing it together. After yesterday, when we spoke about the research paradigm that Franzel took us through, and then Mia spoke about what's a PhD and what's in there. The day before, we had a discussion on what's in an MBA. We also had a taste talking about the writing and the article writing process and how to think about that. Now, almost as a nice foundation, setting the table is then this session where we're going to talk about the specific roles and approaches and styles of supervision. And also the specific responsibilities. And I picked up in some of the comments earlier this week, there are some questions and I made 1 or 2 minor changes to my slides last night just to accommodate some of those questions as well. So as a context, the background where we are, I think it's common sense that there are different approaches to supervision. And it's maybe sometimes a matter of preference. It's a matter of experience. We look at the polls. At the end of the day, there will be a poll to reflect on the sessions today. In there, the majority of delegates have between 1 to 5, or not surprisingly, 5 to 10 or 10 or more years experience. So yes, we have quite a range and hence the different approaches. And the question often that are asked is, what's the right way? Is there a specific recipe? What's the model or the best practice? And in many ways, we can also say to ourselves, best practice is all practice. So maybe the way we're being supervised in the past is not the way we should supervise. And I think a forum like this is a very nice opportunity then to share some thoughts with each other. Other contextual background, we have some challenges faced by supervisors and students, and something that we will talk about in the next slide or discussion we're going to have, and I will also say a bit about that a little later in the session. But I think, and it fits in some of the questions, there are real problems, and they're not a matter of preference. It's real, it's logistical, it's in nature, and some of them are deep-rooted, and we will need to almost get in there and ask the hard questions, say, what are the challenges? And the right thing is to look at the coin from both sides and not just from my side or the side of preference. Expectations, a number of the questions earlier this week asked, how far can we go? What's expected of me? Must I go here? Where's the boundaries? When should I do this? When should I not do this? So I think very appropriate then in this session, as I planned for it before, that it also touched on that specific topic. So yes, if you look at the Europeans will say it's the tip of the iceberg. I think, it's the ears of the hippopotamus. And if you look at this hippo and below these 2 hippos, there's many much more. That's what we try and uncover here today. So I also don't have a doubt that we will be able to wrap it up in an hour. Normally this is a discussion that I take about 2-3 hours to work through with our supervisors. But yes, we will do that. And a key discussion in here, what are the changing roles and responsibilities of our supervisors and students? So you can see I played both ways. Although we supervisors and examiners, I think it's important that we look at things from both ends. And then lastly, as some thoughts before we depart and move over into the next section, what are the things we should look out for? And I try and make that practical. And I think if we look at the questions and the comments in there, hopefully, and I have no doubt that it will complement the session as we continue with that. So to start off, I have, let me just get my slide here. Now I lost my functionality. There it is. Sorry, I'm back. 3 questions that I want to ask, and we're going to go into breakaway rooms immediately after. So on the back end, Rian have divided the group.
Prof, sorry, are you sharing slides now, or because we can't see the?
Oh, thank you, Rian. Sharing slide. Okay, you can see it now. I think it when suddenly there was this change in setting. Okay, but it's all good. You can see the slides now?
No.
Still not. Share the screen. You're good to see it there?
We did see it for a little while and then it went again.
Okay, there it should be there. It's can you see the slides?
No.
No.
Prof HB, I'll also share the slide.
Okay, thank you, Rian. So we're on slide number 3, questions. I'm not sure what happened on this side. Okay, there I can see. So there's 3 questions that I think is very important and appropriate to answer. And we'd like to go in breakaway rooms. So you will be automatically allocated to breakaway rooms. You have the 3 questions. If we can come back after 5 minutes and have a reflection on this to almost open up the discussion building on the context I've just sketched. So Rian, if you can please activate the breakaway rooms for us.
Will do. I'll start the breakout rooms now.
I see there's a few people. I'm just admitting them as we continue, and they will be allocated to breakaway rooms.
Prof, just let me know when I should end the breakout rooms.
I think we can enter on.
Okay.
Thank you.
It'll take about a minute for the rooms to close.
That's all good. I will try and share my slides again. I'm not sure what I saw. There was my screen maximized, and the next moment it disappeared.
Okay, no worries, but I've got it here on this side if I need to.
Will you move my slides then?
I'll move your slides.
Okay, I'll just give you the prompts. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, anybody from the 3 different rooms that want to give a reflection of our experiences? What are we saying to each other? Any thoughts that you would love to share, either in the chat box or people from the different sessions? If you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself. Yes, I see there's Dr. Ayon. Dr. Olise, you're welcome to unmute. Yes. Morning.
Yes, I was in the 3rd group, and what we agreed on was, number 1, there should be commitment on the part of both the students and supervisor, and there should be willingness to learn and co-create both for the supervisor and the students. Then there should also be discipline, both on the part of the supervisor and the student. That it is a journey for both the student and supervisor. We must realize this, and that we must lay a ground rule in the first meeting, detailing what is expected from the student and on the part of the supervisor as well. That was what we agreed on at the 3rd.
Thank you very much for that input. Anybody else that want to add to that? Anything different?
Yes, Prof. Can I just come in quickly?
Yes, please do.
Thank you, sir. No, I mentioned to the group that it is so important to emphasize the difference between a dissertation and a thesis, between student and supervisor, because invariably the students come in from a dissertation perspective and they expect the principles of the dissertation to prevail throughout. So we've got to emphasize that the thesis is an argument that is to prevail and has to be sustained throughout the writing of the thesis. Thank you, sir.
Very true. So it's not just a project, it's much more. There are some very important pointers that I think were raised there. Anybody else that want to add to that? I see there's quite a lot of activities in the chat. We can all follow that. I'm not going to repeat that. But anybody that want to verbally provide some input? We need insight and wisdom, always useful.
Prof HB, sorry. Hi, it's Haki van der Westhuizen.
Yes, Haki.
One of the discussions we had was the importance of having a supervisor and student document or agreement in place. There can always be default on that agreement, but at least if you do that off the cuff, then at least there's commitment and intent shown by both parties.
Very, yeah.
In terms of making the relationship work.
Yeah, so it's almost, I don't want to use the word a contract. Some institutions do have a contract, but the rules of the game. Where are we going to start? In the first contact, what are we saying to each other? Over and above to who are the student, who are you, what are the expectations, to clearly clarify that and decide on, the way forward and the finer detail and the relationship, the responsibilities. Very true, Haki. Maybe a last comment before we move on.
Yeah, HB, I think one can have an institutional MOU, which often happens then, but over and above that, you have your own agreement of how the two of you who are unique, individuals, and how's your relationship going to work between the two of you over and above the institutional MOU.
Very important. So it's a little bit more. So what you say, it's not clinical and cold. There's a personal touch. So Rian, if you can just jump to the next slide. Yes.
Just for instance, I just wanted to say, if a student sends you something at midnight, they need to understand that the next morning they're not going to get your feedback, and you can actually say to them, if you want feedback, you need to allow me so much time in which to send you feedback. Yeah.
That's an important point, and a little bit later I'll talk about the timeline, but I think that's to clarify the expectations, what's possible, because you also have other students to supervise. So I think if you, there's one more, Prof Mickey.
Yes, thank you. Rather than the formalities of contracts, etc., as you've been focusing on, I think another aspect, especially at the PhD or doctoral level, is one principle I have is you cannot give that which you do not have. So I like to see my students being introduced to the local community of practitioners, as well as the academics locally through conferences and workshops, but also the international community. So it's not just about doing that literature review, but where possible, the students presenting their work at international conferences, and for me and the student to be there if possible, so that I can introduce them to that international network of thought leaders in that field. So I'm a maritime economist, and this is, I've found this has really worked well, because this creates relationships that are sustainable with both practice as well as the academia, which then continues after the doctoral dissertation. Thank you.
Thank you for that valuable lens, because I think, and this is what I try and do with these pictures, there are different views. So on the one side, supervisors say this must be a unique study, the student also say, this must stand out, it's, and how we look at that, quite often we get the impression that the discussion is around originality. And I think over and above to what you've just said, thinking about that, the student might say his or her view is when they take an idea and they interpret it differently and provide it back or bring it back in a different way, that's originality. The supervisor might say, no, I need to go to a conference, we need to break the ice, we need to really be paving the form. So there are these different perspectives of uniqueness and differentiation. Quite often in this discussion, and I haven't heard that, is the whole thing about qualitative or quantitative research or mixed methodology. How do you play that? If you look at that 6, I think it's interesting that we must always say we tend to view things differently. My wife always say there's 3 sides to a story, my side, her side, and probably in between the truth. So we look at that 6 or 9, and depending what side of the table you sit, maybe we should say this is what we're talking about. And yes, it's a round hole in a square peg, or other way around. It's interesting. So from what we've been said, I think it's evident that there are a few challenges that we need to consider. Now, what are the techniques we move forward? How do we approach supervisor? What is the best way? Now, in order to answer those questions, and we have another 35 minutes or so to do that, I would love you to move you to the next slide and say, what are the challenges that students face? So let's start with the student. We're speaking amongst ourselves as supervisors to each other. But when we look at the students, we can say in many ways, they kind of almost dependent on the supervisor. And quite often you hear the remark, I cannot move. My supervisor is not giving me feedback. Now, it's not what you've said earlier on, where we submit the thing last night, 12 o'clock, and you don't get feedback in the next morning. But students are feeling frustrated. The supervisors don't admit to problems. This is my challenge. So not seeking advice and comments. I think in this world of co-creation, it's not about who's right and wrong. It's rather about what's being said and having that scholarly discourse. And yesterday, Prof Noel Pierce explained that to us very well, and how you built that. And Mia's also extended on that. So is that discourse is lacking, or do the students see that it's mechanical and I need to do 1, 2, and 3? Because at the end, my objective as a student is to get promoted to a PhD or to get graduated at the master's level. So hence, the supervisor is keeping me back, and I view it as poor progress. There was a live discussion earlier this week on you don't know what you don't know, and if you give feedback to students, they don't always appreciate the depth and the rigor required of a study. So what's in a PhD? What's sitting in a master's dissertation? And we said to each other very clearly, there's a huge difference between a master's short dissertation, a mini dissertation at an MBA level, or full master's dissertation and a PhD thesis. And that's part of the thing to uncover and to discover. How regular should you meet with your supervisor? I think as you set up in the first meeting, it's important to lay those rules as we specified. If you send me something, I will give you feedback in 2 weeks. If there's a timetable that we agree on, I can put it in my calendar. So if I know I'm going to get a chapter or some submission by you on that specific date, I can diarize it and I can turn my feedback quickly around as a supervisor. But here we're saying, what do students experience? What are their difficulties? Many times in the past, and I had a colleague that always said students need to grow into the PhD, that conceptual difficulties that they experience. And then the last point, and there's many more we can add, these students sometimes have friends that are supervisors or supervise elsewhere. So do they play you off against the other supervisor? Or do they talk to colleagues in your department and say, this is what that says? How do you handle that? Now that, whether we like it or not, are frustrating for students, and it definitely creates some tension. So the point I want to drive home here, as we embark on this supervision road, just think for the moment on what is the experience of a student, and ask yourself, is that the right way to do? Now, that little cartoon characters there, I think it's quite often what happens and say, I'm so busy. I'm the head of. I have so many students I supervise, so I can't help you now. And, we must listen and hear what we're saying to the students. And, with that being said, we'll probably come and say, maybe I should think differently about my supervisor's role. And in the next slide, Rian, if we look at the challenges that we experience from a supervisor's perspective, which is almost a flip side. And you can say there, Rian, if you can just move the slide. Yes, thank you. We say there's challenges from the flip side. If we look at the student's view, we say, yes, they're doubting each other. Is my work good enough? What's my supervisor saying of this? I have some emotional challenges. I have a lot of pressure at work. I need to also have things that I need to attend to. I've got commitments. I may be perfectionistic. That's quite often a problem. You have students and they want to do it in a specific way, and you as a supervisor will say, the text needs to be left aligned or right justified, or I need this tense or that tense. So there are those things that it's easier to say, but it's not always difficult, or it's not always easy to react to. I'm not enjoying the topic, not knowing what is expected of me. I lack of skills and stress. That's quite often the students face. I've got working arrangements, practical issues, money, lifestyle, getting hold of my supervisor. I quite often hear the story of, I cannot get hold of my supervisor. He's not returning my calls. In my previous life, this was a huge frustration of me, and I think that's something we're getting better at as institutions, to say, you have the responsibility to get back to your student. My supervisor or a qualitative expert or quantitative expert and doesn't know much about this topic. That's also a frustration. And yesterday, one of the comments, we said it's important that you look at the fit between the supervisor and the student, not just from a topic or a focus perspective, maybe also from a methodological perspective. And that's something we must consider here. Lack of support and writer's block. It's easy to say to the student, you must write the page every day. And if you look at ourselves as supervisors, if you write the article or on your own studies, did you write the page every day? Or is it a matter of, I need to focus. I take a Friday and a Saturday and Sunday, or take some sabbatical to do that. Now, when we look at these things, we can clearly see there's a view of a student, a view of the supervisor. Now, with that as a foundation, I specifically thought about the next slide, which I think summarize it for us and say what is expected. So Rian, if you can just move to the next slide, please. So if you look at that one, then we can say to each other, in reality, and if we're totally honest with each other in supervision, there's the role of the supervisor, there's a student, and there's university. And maybe between these three parties, there's some tension. Are we saying to each other, the university is just there to take the money off the student, like on that picture, and the supervisor is there to sit back, relax, here and there, give some pointers, but it's the student's work. I am, as a supervisor, already have my doctorate. I don't need a second doctorate, so it's a student that work. And at the end, the students stand there and need to carry all the burden, or this PhD, or the master's in that specific point that we talk about. Now, if we look at that, we must say to each other, there are definitely different understandings of a relationship. And that's something we will need to explore. And I think the questions that we had feedback and reflected on pointed that one out, and I think those are very pertinent issues that's raised there. The quality and the effect of that relationship definitely have impact on the writing of research. So we need to think about how do we manage the expectations, and maybe we're overcomplicating that. It's probably simple. If I look at the next slide, we unpack each one of them in a bit more depth, we can say, when I look at the first one, and let's look at the role of students expect from university. I study at this university because it's my alma mater. I think it's a reputable university. I only hear good about university, so I'm expecting a good experience. I paid the money. I want that. It's a high quality institution, very well acknowledged, and everybody know about them. I need to access resources, so I want the library. I need to talk to people. I need guidance and submission. I see it as an interactive and a pleasant experience. And then sometimes the supervision process between the student and the supervisor goes sour, and that's everything except what they get. Or there's a great experience with the supervisor, the student, and administratively one of the other divisions and departments, whether it's the library or the finance division, doesn't come to the party or not as prompt as the supervisor, and you have that breakdown. So students are clear. They expect certain things from university. Similarly, they also expect certain things from the supervisor. The supervisors must be qualified. They need guidance. They need some pointers. What are the regulations, the documents? So supervisors must know the templates, what's in there, provide them with the right stuff, must be aware how the process work. And if you look at those pointers there, the supervisors is in many cases doing much more than what we'll typically expect from a supervisor. And that always remains a very interesting phenomenon to observe. If you just go back, no, sorry, that's there. And if you look at that on top of that picture, what are supervisors expecting of the students? So, and I think, this is quite often where the relationship breaks down. I don't find enthusiasm there. I don't see creativity. We're almost following a recipe. And we said a few times during the week, there's no cookie cutter approach here. There's no recipe. Every study is different. You base it on the objective. And we had a discussion yesterday, and we'll continue today. How do we unpack that? And who's owning the degree? So we need to manage these expectations. And as a supervisor, it's our role. And as a student, we need to understand that. Now, the question is, how do I manage that relationship? And I see there's some comments in the chats. Now, if you think about this relationship on the next slide, to really be able to manage that relationship, we must say there are definitely responsibilities for a student. And without any doubt, there's also responsibilities of a supervisor. But let's look at that of a student. And there's many things we can talk about. So in essence, what do we expect? And it's against the expectations and managing that. So defining the clear rules or the rules of engagement, or what you expect as a supervisor from the student on day one, it's important. And vice versa, you need to listen clearly to what the students are also saying to you. So when we look at the roles of a student, we actually say this needs to be an independent piece of work with a contribution to the field. So don't just give me quotations and to copy and paste from other articles and what other people said. You need to have a proper discourse like Prof Mias explained to us yesterday. We're expected to be proud of what we have in here. It must be the highest standard. So at the end, you're going to put this on the library shelf. It will be associated with you forever. So as a student, you have the responsibility really to put in your best. Now, what I really appreciate if students come to me and say they want to do a good project, they want to move the needle, they want to be proud of what they do, and can a supervisor assist them doing that and push them far. It's not just coming in and say, I tick a few boxes and I just want to get my PhD, or I just want to get my master's because I need this. My employer told me so. Definitely there's a matter of attitude that one need to consider in here. You must be aware of the academic rules and regulations. There are certain protocols, certain things that you need to adhere to. The working relationship, my view, is one of the most important things, because you will see later on, I say sometimes supervisors play different roles than a supervisor. They're psychologists, they're advisors, they're friends, you know, they do a lot of things, they're administrative, but we'll get to that. So in here we say the role of a student is to make progress, but the supervisor's role is to assist and facilitate that, to guide the student. Remember, we as supervisors have supervised more than one student. We understand the process. For many of these students, if they're in a PhD, it's their second study of this nature over and above their master's. So they are not that well experienced, and we must take them through. Or they will come from a different institution and have different experiences, and are you open enough to accommodate that in, have different views? And yesterday Franzel shared with us that there's no right or wrong view to argue around your research paradigm. It's a matter of how you motivate that. And that's the beauty of the thing, but that's also the daunting part that supervisors in many cases struggle to make peace with or to digest. I think those points on the conferences were made earlier, and the publications were meant there. IP issues. So these things were flagged already, and there are many more. We can probably go and add a long list to this. If we move to the next slide, we must reflect on the roles of a supervisor. And we say, if we look at the supervisor in this case, the supervisor should be well involved in the study. So you must not every time start in day one. You must really know where the study is, what's next, what have the student done in the past, what are the ground rules, and you must understand the study. So part of the challenge, if you supervise 6 or 7 students, is actually engage with the students, not to get confused between that. And I had some comments in the past where students saying to me, the supervisor confused me, and that tell me I'm not special, they haven't paid attention. So there's a very fine line between authority versus responsibility, and how you move that into the students in a developmental approach, almost coaching, guiding, advising, beyond a more supervisor where you just give feedback. On this matter, I must also say a comment I got in past from students, and that's important. They say sometimes supervisors don't give them proper and good feedback. It's merely technical. I like your chapter. There's a few spelling errors corrected, but there's no constructive, conceptual feedback. So as you supervise, part of the responsibilities of a good supervisor then is to also challenge the student, to stretch their mind, to make sure that you don't just become an editor in that process. And specifically the younger supervisors I experienced in the past do struggle with this. And if you think about this way, maybe we can then summarize and say, so what are the roles of a supervisor? And if we look at the next slide, we specifically then say there are various functions, you know, and on the left-hand side, they're all listed there. And I see in the comment, you know, integrity underpinned by unconditional positive regard, you know, different concepts, exactly. And that's content feedback. But on this slide, do you have the view of that picture on the top right-hand side of the slide and say, in come this Mr. Ego, and I will humble this person. At the end, they would actually realize it's being a learning curve for that. Is that my attitude when I supervise? Or do I follow the approach in the bottom and say, going to the drawing board, I apply my mind and I become a co-creator. I don't dominate the student's voice. I listen to his or her voice. I add my little lens to that, and I facilitate that process. And in that, I also learn. So I also need to go and do some research on topic. I also need to go and do some reading. And together, we apply our minds. Hence, I'm a true advisor and a supervisor and not just a quality control measure, which is one of the roles, but you don't just do technical edits. So yeah, maybe we can say we wear different hats, and they're there, you can read through that, and I think that's the reality. At the end, supervisor or students say, but my supervisor allowed me to submit. Now, yes, we not the examiner. There's always 2 or 3 external examiners, sometimes one abroad. So as a supervisor, we're not involved in the examination process. But when you say to the student, you can submit, you are actually taking a bold step and say, if I were the examiner on this one, I would be competent and comfortable that you will pass. There will always be some feedback. You ask 3 academics, 3 opinions, and you will get 3 different opinions. But you need to balance all these roles at a given moment in time. And that's sometimes difficult. So my urge to you, and as you engage with the students, think about the other roles over and above the content feedback, because it becomes almost an art, how you can assist and provide feedback to a student. Now, as we try and wrap it up, and we look at the next slide, specifically some common challenges and problems we experience, and please, you're welcome to add them to the chat box if there's more. Students don't know what they don't know, so we must guide them and say, how can I manage that? How can I assist you? You want to do your literature review in a month. That's not going to happen, not because I think you cannot. It just takes more time to digest that. If you want to execute your data collection and you have focus groups, it takes some time, and then you need to analyze and digest that. And maybe you need to build in extra time to go back and, to re-interview somebody or to have further reflections on that. So we must almost have a common sense, a realistic approach to bring to the table and assist students. We must manage the unrealistic expectations of research. Like the earlier comment, I submitted 12 o'clock and when can I expect the feedback? It happened to me the other day. The student really did that. And then the Thursday morning she phoned me and say, can we talk this afternoon? I say, no, we can't not talk this afternoon. I've got a busy day, but we can talk next week. So that's what you need to manage, that unrealistic expectations. I also had the experience many, many years ago where a student once came to me and said, so what must I do next? What should I do in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3? And say, I can't tell you that. I can assist you. We can talk about that. She said, but one of my colleagues was the head of department back then, actually sit down with his students and he give them very clear instructions. This is what I need from you. And I had to sit this student down and explain to him, maybe that's not my way and this is not the way I believe. And at the end, I think it was a very good supervisor-student relationship that we went through there. A big confusion or a big challenge, I think, is bullet number 3 and 4 there, where we say, when you look at the formulation of your question, your objective, how you unfold your conceptual theory in the framework and the guidance you give as an examiner. And I'm speaking from that perspective now. Quite often when I look at things I examine, I say to myself, is this the fault of the student or is it sloppy supervision? Now, we can argue both ways. I believe it's sloppy supervision. Supervisors need to be able to say to students, there's a flawed design here, think about this, but sometimes supervisors also miss that. Hence, supervisors need to engage with each other. But I think it will be wrong to put the blame 100% on the supervisor, because at the end, the student have a voice and the student must argue in this process because it's a co-creation experience. It's not the one person that always needs to listen to the others and follow that advice. At the end, if the student are promoted to a PhD in not any ways or many ways, in all ways, you should be equal. Maybe you have more experience as a supervisor, but in the subject context, that student should be able to go and defend the study. And to be able to defend that study, it's important that they can argue. And if you didn't allow them to grow their confidence, to let their voice come through, they will not be able to argue, they will not be able to defend. And then we can say many ways they're not able or they're up to the standard of that one. So there's a comment here I see looking at the chat by Quibus. Supervisors also need to be cautious. And I think that's very important. That's arrogance effect. I cannot agree more. Lawson, never be perfect. 100% the case. So there's challenges that we find. And a lot of the challenges is not always logistical of nature. It's not a breakdown in communication. Sometimes it's just on the content. Are you as a supervisor really able to unlock this value of the study for the student? Are the student really able to unlock the value and tap into your mind as a supervisor in moving forward? So most cases, we must set the personal problems aside. I personally, always checking on the students, how they're doing, but the whole hour or hour and a half discussion cannot be on personal matters. Sometimes it happens because you get to know each other better. But in the engagement with students on feedback, try and focus on the content and be those roles that we spoke about in the previous slide, but also go beyond that and make sure that you really get involved into the supervision content. I see here there's Paladi. Paladi, welcome back. You've been very active in your discussions this week. Appreciate that. Supervisors do not always provide constructive feedback. Exactly the point. If you want to say this is not a good chapter, you must be able to say, I need you to do or consider 1, 2, and 3 to strengthen this chapter. And if you can't do that, you actually don't have much of an impact. So you must be an impact player. You must really push that thing to the fore. So there are important qualities of ideal research candidates, and there are many more. I just thought of highlighting a few. Now, what I don't think we should do is to take this slide and say to a student, hey, this is what you need to be living up to. That's not the intention. We just need to understand we need to, in the supervision process, besides getting the study to be examined and published from that, actually develop this individual into becoming a confident individual that will be able to defend and move the scholarly debate forward. Because at the end, the study is research driven and there must be impact, making a difference for an industry, making a difference for society. So looking beyond the obvious. And then if we move to the next slide and the second last slide, if we look at this one, we can say, yes, there are definitely some shortcomings that we need to always think of, affecting the study. Quite often it's a timeline issue. People will run out of time, they underestimate that. And it's part of your role to say, you're not going to make the graduation if you go on this pace. Somewhere you need to put in more sweat. Study takes time. It's not just quickly writing a few pages, and sometimes the writing of substandard, it's a lot of quotations and fluff and a waffle pulled from all over, but not a clear golden rule. And I think Noel explained it to us in writing the article very clearly, and even Ralph touched on that yesterday. What is that golden line of argument that we need to bring to the fore? So there are a few challenges, and they listed there. Do we blame it on the student and say you're lazy? Do I blame it on me and say I got busy at work? Do I blame it on COVID? At the end, you're busy with the study. You should enjoy the study as a supervisor. And while you and the student are having fun and throwing ideas around and testing each other, you also grow as individuals. And that's the creative process. And there's a session later today. We'll look at that knowledge creation and how to look at the application. And this basically is just introducing that. The second last bullet, in the last one, I feel very passionate about and say there must always be that curiosity. I need more. What can I go more? And there was some good articles that were shared in the chat earlier this week. The ability to learn. It's not that the study when I graduate with my PhD or master's, that is the end. That's actually the beginning. So what's happening thereafter? So in many ways, this is the key that unlock the future for the student, that unlock and open up this discourse or contribute to this. Even it might be minor, there must always be an impact. So you must remain enthusiastic, you must remain passionate about that. And if you look at it, there's many different ways to approach the shortcomings. And if you really are honest with yourself, you must say, it's a humbling experience to supervise. And it's also a daunting experience because we're not tapping into experience necessarily. We're also talking about moving the academic and scholarly debate forward. Hence, there's a rigorous discussion that you yourself, over and above to your student, must also follow. Then if we move to the last slide, I want to say drawing the boundaries.
Sorry,
Yes,
Prof
Rian?
HB, I see Tineke Wolfers has got a hand raised for a while. I'm not sure if you want to...
Okay, sorry. We actually, the last slide is the question answer. So Tineke, you're welcome to answer. Sorry, I've missed that one.
Yeah, so there's one thing that hasn't been broached at all, and that is how are supervisors appointed by institutions?
Yeah.
I've had very different experiences from different institutions. At USB, for instance, you know, we've got to go through proper supervision training, proper examination training. You know, there's a question on why do you want to supervise? What is your purpose as a supervisor? And I found that extremely helpful. And at other institutions, I sometimes just think people, their friends are appointed, and then I, as an examiner, as an external examiner, when I then examine some of the dissertations at master's level, and I see that there's a research, you know, aim, but no research questions or objectives, and the student has actually responded in their findings to interview questions. Then I ask myself, how could it, where was the supervisor? And if the student has then paid R250,000, and, you know, I mean, how could any supervisor allow that to go through? Then it's hard for me to actually say, do I fail the student? Because where was the problem, you know? So I think this is quite an important thing. How do institutions ensure that supervisors are sufficiently qualified to supervise their students who are actually investing a lot in doing their master's or doctorate at that institution?
Yeah. Tanika, thank you for that valuable input. Definitely very, very true. Because you might argue that supervisors have experience elsewhere, and you know, you must still put them through a training to say, this is my forms, this is our process. Because at the end, you know, if I go to a restaurant and I pay for a meal with my family and I don't get good service, I will never come back, and it's a bad experience. And in many ways, we need to think about our supervision like that. So I agree fully with what you said, and I do hope that all institutions put in effort with all supervisors, and over and above doing that training, have regular forums, and that's what worked well for us at Da Vinci, where we have regular engagement with our supervisors and talk about matters over and above the process and the forms and administrative nature, because it's we can not only learn from each other, but yeah, you must do justice to the money being paid. Very valid point there, Tanika. I appreciate that. We have about 5 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, yeah, 6 minutes. Are there any other questions? You're welcome to raise your hand. Prof Mickey, over to you, and I will quickly check the chats.
Yes, thank you. I was quite shocked to hear that value of 250,000 for supervision of a dissertation or a thesis from the previous colleague there, because
no, that's not for supervision. That's the whole. I'm just saying they invest
student fee.
Student fee.
All right. But even so, that's still quite shocking, because, I mean, it's understandable in some institutions, but I'll just give an example. Many of our students and at University of KwaZulu-Natal are not paying any fees. So they do their doctoral studies, they register full-time, and if they register full-time, there's a special subsidy there, which means that they do not pay any tuition fees for the 3 years that they are registered. If they go beyond the 3 years, then they need to start paying. And of course, there's a contract in place. If they don't complete, then they have to pay back or something like that. Whether they do is another story. But I'm just saying the incentive is very different. If you've got a student who's paying 250,000 to do their DBA or PhD, we got a student who's in there for free. You know, it's just slightly different in some respects. And just to keep that in mind, as well as the kind of remuneration that the supervisors are receiving and the kind of training. So just keep that mix in mind, and not everyone's got the same scenario. Thank you.
Yeah, now that the subsidy do make a difference. Not all institutions have that, and I think that's part of the contextual background. You have different approaches and rules of faculties, and you know, all these opportunities. Very, very, very valid point. Cecile, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. So I was just thinking that everything you're saying, it's 100% correct in terms of expectations, roles, and the ideal student. But I think one needs to kind of take this further in terms of our context. It's business school students who are working in full-time jobs, often in leadership and management positions. So they're very busy students. They've got lives, families, And I think a lot of that kind of impacts on supervision and how much we can do. So like we could say to them, go read articles, go source articles, write critically, time management. But at the end of the day, the nature of the student really poses a challenge. And then also the fact that they're coming from diverse fields. And, you know, many times we haven't supervised them, we haven't taught them in year 1, 2, or 3. So they're coming from different fields. Some of them haven't really engaged theory, some are engineering students, and they get frustrated when you say write a literature review. So I think it's just like, how do you engage business school students given their unique challenges? Yeah, thank you.
I think, no, that's, Cecile, very valid. So behind this, you know, you must go and look at what the different institutions do, because that's our experience. There's a lot of support that need to go in over and above and beyond the supervisor from the institution side. There must be many safety nets in place, because in many cases the students arrive there and they had an easy ride to the previous institution, or it's the first time they tackle a master's, or they think after completing a master's they can just do a similar project and get a PhD. A huge difference. And I think that discussion yesterday clarified that. But you're 100% correct. I think it's what I said earlier, it's a complex environment we are in, and, you know, there's no golden rule or recipe. Prof Clayton, I see you got your hand raised, and then there's some comments in there that I think it's valid, touching base on the point we just discussed. But Clayton, your contribution, input, your view?
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, again, you know, a statement, but making the statement in as a question to ask for the opinion on the statement. I have a little bit of a cynical view of this business school student that wants to do an MBA or a DBA, and then you know, plays the sympathy card of, oh, but I'm so busy, kind of with the help me towards the deadline. You know, I see it extremely frequently, and maybe I'm less sympathetic to it because I'm the, you know, gentleman academic that also has a full-time day job in you know, a professional role. But I didn't ask you, not in a mean way, just like I didn't ask you, the student, to try and take this on part-time, right? And there are still standards, and we can't. I find, and as I say, it might be a cynical view, but I find that very often that request for sympathy comes with a implicit, yeah, but can't you just, you know, let this one slide, or can't you just, you know, help me out here, or and I think it's pernicious in the business school thing, in that we hearing more and more of, oh, but, you know, it got so much to do. Well, then if you can't cope, you can't cope. I just think back to Prof Sean Gossel, you know, and the process he talks through the student and saying, do you have the skills? Do you have the experience to do this properly? And if you don't, well, go somewhere else, type thing. Not in a mean way, just in a, you know, if you can't run a marathon, then don't try. You're going to hurt yourself. Diplomatic, firm, but yeah, no, that's valid. So I think, very true. And, you know, those industry projects that the students sometimes want to come and present as a research dissertation or as a PhD thesis, that's where a lot of these problematic and challenges come in. Colleagues, I really enjoyed that, but now I must put on my role as a moderator, and I don't want to back off from the questions. You can still pose them, but it's 10 o'clock. And we need to move into the next session. So this, let's take a 5-minute break. There was some of the feedback we received yesterday, which are very insightful, and thank you for the people that took the effort. We will post the link again today. Said, you know, the breaks are a bit short. We need more time, and I suspect, you know, it's important. So if we can stop the session here, and then in 5 minutes from now we'll move over into the next session. And then thank you very much for all the comments. My wife said I can never multitask, so I try and focus on what I was saying, but I will go and read them in more depth and respond to some of them. But I appreciate that, and I really wish you luck with this role of supervision, and say it's the important responsibility entrusted on you, and then take ownership and pride in being a supervisor. And all these things we spoke about, I think it will help us to understand the role of a supervisor better. And then, yes, we will make mistakes, and we will learn as we go along, and we will become more experienced. Hence, we must share with each other. And it's not easy. It's hard work to supervise. But
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the input and discussions. Let's take a quick leg stretch break, and at 5 past we will be back. Thank you very much. Colleagues, I trust that you filled your coffee mugs up or have a glass of water. I did both in the break just now. It's 5 past 10, so let's move into the next section. And this is the second session where we're going to look at the supervising the research design and the research methodology and how to create knowledge. And it's a privilege and honor of me to welcome Professor Ben Anderson from the Da Vinci Institute here. If I can quickly introduce Ben to the people in the room. Prof Anderson was involved in the development of working adults and how to engage with them and how to address their learning needs. And that was mainly the topic of his PhD. And as a result of that, the University of the Free State established the business school. And following this study, they then developed and introduced, and he was key in that part, the Bachelor of Commerce in the Management of Leadership, and also the MBA program, really taking it to a practical level. Hence, I cannot think about a better person to talk to us about this topic. After his PhD, Professor Anderson then joined the first RAND group, and he was its Chief Learning Officer, and he took the division to next levels, including the accreditation of education provider at FNB. And then in 2005, he became the co-founder of the Da Vinci Institute. And amongst many things he did, he introduced the certificate and also the diploma and also a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master's and a PhD, all with a focus on the management of technology and innovation. And if you listen to Prof Anderson and everything he say, wherever you go, he really preached to local and international environment and markets the importance of managerial leadership and working with adults and the focus on practice. And I think you will definitely see and experience that passion as he shares his thoughts on the very important topic of supervising the research design, the methodology, and the knowledge creation. So with any further ado, warm heart of welcome, Prof Anderson. We're curious to your presentation, and that will take us all the way up to 5 to 11, and the last 10 minutes we will then use for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Thanks, colleagues, for the opportunity. I want to, by way of introduction, before we go to the slides in more detail, just want to say I am very aware of the triad between self and other and context. And in doing this presentation today and talking to each other as supervisory colleagues, I will hope that we can constantly consider our engagement as self with other and context. Now, looking at research design and research methodology and knowledge creation, I secondly want to remind myself of the play between what we will refer to as the industrial economy versus the creative economy. And I just wonder by myself whether we appreciate the difference in how the core ideas are formalized in the traditional industrial economy and versus that of the creative economy. Similarly, the role of technology in the industrial economy versus that of the creative economy, but also looking at the organizational model changes between these two economies, how knowledge is distributed, and what is the core business ideologies underpinning these. And on those details, Jaak has got interesting references. I'm not going to deal with that now in detail, but I can provide that afterwards. But on business ideology and managing complexity with specific reference within the creative network economy, I am also wondering whether we as supervisors at business schools are aware of the play between what can traditionally be described as a collaborative workspace, a coordinated workspace, and a cooperative workspace. And maybe just in terms of the trajectory, if we start with a coordinated workplace reality where everything is divided or built around a central expertise, and that when that expertise fades or something happens or it is interjected, then the system usually collapses. When you go to a collaborative engagement, you see where the engagement amongst members of a community of practice, where ideas are introduced by central figures still within the hierarchy of the workplace, but is explored through participation. So it's a more open system. There's more energy flow between people. But yet, if the central anchor of that collaborative engagement disappears or passes away or moves on, usually the system again go into our hitters. And I've seen this often between universities and even at business schools. We've got a collaborative arrangement with another university in another African country or another European country. It works perfectly until the professor colleague on the other side retires. And then the collaboration has to be reignited. So it must always be driven centrally and ignited by some energy. But in the cooperative workspace, we see a reality which refers to a self-directed choice to engage, where people are all knowledge workers and equals, and where everybody participating in that cooperative space wants to share and wants to give and wants to contribute. So nobody's waiting for each other to actually show the direction, but all of them are co-creators in cooperating towards a more improved and a better future. So I wanted to be aware that I'm also looking through that lens when I talk about knowledge production and design and methodology today. I would also like to remind myself on the principles of research that one should consider when you want to talk about design and methodology. And that is, the first principle is about the importance of application. How do we think around that? Do we think of it as a backward practice because in the real academic world we don't do application, or in very rare instances? The second principle is that of transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. How do we really then acknowledge, if we are cooperatively involved in looking at the world and the ecosystem as a place where there are more than one discipline, and that you can actually cooperatively work with more discipline at the same time, that the brain has the power to actually engage multiple disciplines in looking at a specific challenge that we may be faced with. I also want to look at the notion or the principle of heterogeneity, where we appreciate that there are different ways of looking at the same thing, and that there is no right or wrong, that it's in all cases a both and. Then the notion of reflectivity and accountability, that it creates an awareness of the impact and the implications of the research issue within the self, the organization, the broader community, and the research desire or issue and goal involves being social accountable. And lastly, the principle of quality control, which is should be guided by a good deal of practice, usefulness of evidence-based application, and again, contribution to the self, the industry, the community, and society at large. In my assessment of examinations, especially at the PhD level, it concerns me of how limited our view is of the global reality surrounding what the research topic may be. And that's just as a side note. So the last thing that I want to share is that I'm very aware also about the different types of research that one can conduct. And in the main, looking at the notion of exploratory research, or whether we're involved in descriptive research, and or whether we're involved in explanatory research. I often find as a supervisor this as a very important guideline, guideline going forward, to ask my students, so let's just remind ourselves, are you working in what type of research? Are you explanatory, exploratory, or descriptive? Because I often find people would say to me, well, I'm going to do exploratory research. But then they will use methodologies that are actually explanatory. So the contradictions in the logical argument is easily traceable if you can have as a guideline upfront what is the type of research journey that you're going to embark on: exploratory, explanatory, or descriptive. So I just thought I want to give those few introductory comments before we start talking about more details around knowledge production and design and methodology. And I want to ask Rian if he can now give us the first question, which I would like us to go into breakaway rooms. And the question that I want you just to look at now is, what role does the systemic awareness of the supervisor play in creating knowledge? And if we can take the next 5 minutes just to work on that question and share with me your insights. Thanks, Rian.
Break rooms started.
Thank you very much for those feedback sessions that, well, I've had some, but maybe we can get some feedback from the group. Are there anybody specific from the group?
Benny, I think in 22 seconds the group breaker rooms will close, so it's not all closed yet.
Ah, sorry, I just thought everybody's back.
I see the message on my side, 11 seconds, so they will be back 9, 8, just now.
Okay, so Harvey, maybe we can just get some feedback on question 1 from a few colleagues.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I see breaker rooms are getting back. Any feedback to Professor Anderson on the first question?
Claudia, you had such good input. If you want to share that.
Thank you, Tanika. Claudia? Dr. Sigamoni?
Thank you. So we basically looked at the systemic awareness, and I think what we concluded with, you know, my notion about the systemic environment was not just to interrelate the student and the supervisor, but looking at the system as a whole, so that we include experiential learning, we include current literature, old literature, as well as newer ones, and emerging thoughts, and create some kind of discourse around that and make that a systemic approach, because, you know, as supervisors and as a policy states, let's not go back to the older literature and sources and cite them, but can we look at something, you know, on a holistic view and deduct newer knowledge out of that, and thereby creating, you know, some closure to gaps and opening newer ones. That was just my thinking around the systemic awareness, and thereby, you know, just creating some kind of systems coaching or systemic coaching, and going forward and becoming increasingly popular in terms of representing what we are trying to look at in terms of the co-creations and thinking systemically. That was my input. Thank you so much, Taneke. Thank you, Prof.
Claudia, I think this is so valuable. One of my greatest insights was in a visit to South America, to Peru, and we met Iman there, and it was amazing how he made this point in different words, in saying, if you want to be real in the now, you should be able to lift yourself to the level of the condor, to see yesterday and tomorrow at the same time. Now, your point that we should not just look to what is always new and what is ahead of us, but what is behind us is critically important. And I often find it sad that we will almost not acknowledge if, as you may rightly say, if something has been said in the 1940s. But if you look at it ecosystemically, there may be great insights for the 1940s in 2020. You know, if I look at the industrial revolutions, and if we look at that trajectory from the first to we are now in the fifth, hopefully, and not the fourth anymore, there are still great learnings from the first, because rightly so, even being in the fifth industrial revolution, there are still some things happening which is related to the first industrial revolution, even although we're sitting in 2021. So thanks for that contribution. I really appreciate it. So for the sake of time, can take one more comment? Claudia, you want to continue?
Do you put your hand raised?
Yes, Prof. Having said that, now listen to you carefully. Yesterday, it came up under the comments where there was almost a disacknowledging of old information and old references, where the comments came, this is dated, this is dated, this is dated. Can you just reconcile the 2 points for me, please?
Well, I'll be honest. I look at if something makes sense in the now and I have to pull it back from the past, I will use it.
Makes sense. Thank you.
So I want to share, can I get slides? Can we then just move on, Rian? Can I get the next slide, please? So let's talk a little bit more. I think when we want to engage dynamically in the knowledge creation journey, we should always be aware what is the aim of research. And I mean, I'm amongst colleagues here that are much more experienced than me, but I think it's critically that we must, as supervisor and students, say, so let's just be clear, what is the aim of research? And I want to make a simple comment here, is I sometimes find that, especially at a master's level, we are not busy with research per se, but we are busy with a project. Now, if we want to link this to the academic institution and to the university, then I would still want to call from my side on the importance of understanding the aim of research versus the aim of solving a problem. Because the aim of research may have the intention to solve something, but I think it should in the main be rather about probing possible solutions. Even in not finding a solution can be a great achievement as part of the aim of research. Then the notions of mode 1, mode 2, mode 3 for some of us may just be words, or maybe, you know, just a matter of people wanting to use fancy frames. Well, in my mind, I do think that the notion of mode 1 as predominantly a systematic engagement that we see traditionally at academic institutions and universities per se, often allows for a linear engagement in developing knowledge, which per se is not wrong. But I do think we must be acknowledging that it is linear and that it can be meaningful and that it can make a great difference is not to be doubted. The second mode, as defined for some time now, is the notion of looking at things almost in a combination of systematic and systemic, but that it is about the application, it is about the production of knowledge in a more transdisciplinary sense, it's less linear, and it should be situationally and contextually grounded. Again, that does not assume that the best knowledge can be created in that context, but that is one way of looking at creating knowledge. And the mode 3 is very much focused on very definitely thinking systemically around the production of knowledge. That is almost more important to understand the process of knowledge creation than the creation of knowledge per se. Now, we may all sit in different modalities here. We may all have different reasons why we will abide to mode 1, mode 2, or mode 3. But to a previous question that was asked about the student's frame of thinking, how do we ask and workshop almost the notions of mode 1, 2, and 3 in some way with our students? Do we ask them, let's get to an understanding where your position? Are you going mode 1? Are you going mode 2? Are you going mode 3? Are you going a combination? Let's talk about it so that we can indeed be guided and flexible in the knowledge creation process to really allow the co-creation of something meaningful. If I look at the literature, it seems to me that the principles to be considered within a business school environment, if we really want to escape the traditional, as I referred to in the beginning, the industrial economy, you know, way of thinking of knowledge creation, then I think we should ask, you know, where the ideas was about on knowledge, you know, the business ideology was about the science of management, where it was about hierarchy and standardized practices and specialized tasks and jobs and planning control and predominantly extrinsic in nature. If we really want to look at business schools, it seems to me, and we want to manage the complexity and we want to understand it and understand the necessity to continuously probe and sense and respond, probe and sense and respond, and engage workers by enabling autonomy and mastery and a sense of purpose, then the principles of application, of transdisciplinarity, of heterogeneous engagements, of reflection, of accountability and of quality control would seem to me as principles to at least be considered by each one of us who would be supervising people within a business school environment. So before we get to the research design, we can just go back to the slide, Rian. I would just like to know if there's maybe one last comment. I know we're running, time is short. Is there maybe one urgent comment on knowledge creation?
Benny, I don't see any comments. If somebody wants to raise a hand, I don't see a hand raised at the moment.
Maybe I would just ask somebody, Tsegofatsu, any comments on knowledge creation? Any ideas, differing ideas? Tsegofatsu, are you with us?
Prof, yes, I'm there.
So let's hear your voice.
Come again with the question, Prof.
So I want to say, do you have any differing views or thing as alternative around knowledge creation?
Yeah, I think as speakers have said several times, the main objective of the dissertations and the thesis is to make sure that on the PhD level is to look at someone who can create the knowledge, bring something new on what he has already learned from the previous authors of articles and the dissertation and the books.
Great. Okay, thanks for that, Tsegofatsu. Appreciate it. So the next thing I would like to do is I would like us to go into a group again and just reflect a bit on the notion on question 2, Rian, if we can just get question 2. How does a supervisor facilitate the formalization and articulation of a well-integrated and inclusive research design? We can take 5 minutes and just spend some time on that. Harvey, are we all back?
Benny, no, they're still in progress. So I think 1 second, and then we have about 12 minutes left. They're coming back in, 90 to 104. So delegates are joining us. Welcome back. As we have here, if we can then reflect on that second question, any input, any feedback to Prof Anderson or to the audience? Just raise your hand to unmute yourself or add chat to the comment, please.
I'm almost tempted to ask Anne for a comment.
Not me, Benny. I'm only facilitating. Not big brains in this community to think what I have to say.
Oh my goodness, I'm not sure about that. Trevor, can you maybe share anything from your side?
Misha?
Sorry, I know that what some institutions do is that in one instance, the one institution has created a diploma while those potential doctoral students will first have to do a diploma in research design and methodology. So they spend a whole year looking at all of these issues, because I think at the end of the day, it could be quite overwhelming to quite a number of students, even while you're supervising them, to engage all these issues.
So it's almost building a bridge by having that program.
Yes.
Meshach,
and I find it, yeah, I think I find it very useful though, for students.
Yeah, I think that could be making a great contribution. Meshach, you raised your hand.
Thank you. I was just trying to summarize or reflect back some of the points that were raised or mentioned in our group. So the question was, how does a supervisor facilitate the formalization and articulation of a well-integrated and inclusive research design? So in our group, we thought the supervisor need to help the student to appreciate the full context of the research. First, the context. So if a research is focusing on maybe a country, the supervisor need to help the student to deep into that context of that issue within the context and globally. Secondly, the student need to look at the literature, both the theory related that or that pin that type of issue that he's looking at, so that he can understand what theory underpin it. Thirdly, to provide a summary of what has been done previously in terms of what issue has been investigated related to the subject, what method has been used, what scope has been covered, so that based on this, you can articulate the research design for the subject. A very important point that was mentioned also is that the supervisor need to listen to the student, and then after listening to the student, then reflect on what the student has said, reflect back to what the student has said, and then provide guidance. So the supervisor should not assume that he has all the knowledge, but actually listen to the student regarding the subject. Then the Dr. Cruz or Professor Cruz mentioned something very important, that epistemology of how to underpin or how to influence what is mentioned, just like it was discussed yesterday. I think those are some of the points. I know Dr. Is it Mark? Mias had something very interesting, if you may want to add that to it.
Maybe at this stage, I want to say, Meshach, thanks for that. I'm just aware of our time constraints, but thanks for the feedback thus far. Rian, if we can move to the next slide. So thanks, colleagues. I also hear how we talk sometimes interchangeably between what is research design and research methodology. And I hope we can talk to that a little bit later on. I think, just to recap from my side, when we want to look at creating an inclusive design, we should indeed be aware of what is the role of paradigm and what is the paradigm that we need to acknowledge in scoping that design. Why is my research necessary, and what strategy should suit my study specifically? Those are two questions which I, as a supervisor, want my student and candidates to argue with me in the attempt to assist them in facilitating that research design. Similarly, the role of purpose, the purpose of research should be acknowledged in that design. And as I've said before, the role of type. And we know there are three main types, which is the explanatory research, the exploratory research, and the causal research. Sampling forms another important point within the research design. How are we going to do the sampling? The sources of data is important. How are we going to acquire meaningful data? How are we going to collect? How are we going to analyze and evaluate that data? So the sampling, the sources of data, the data collection procedures, tools and methods, and the data analysis and integrity processes. Those are, in my mind, at least important pointers towards assisting the student in developing an inclusive and well-rounded systemic research design. Now, I'm sometimes concerned that we speak methodology whilst we haven't concluded the design phase of the research. So it's almost as if we go from I've got a problem, I've got an aim, and I've got questions, and then I've got a methodology that I'm going to follow. But like anything, if you look at the architecture of a house as an analogy, houses that are not well designed will have infrastructural flaws. They will have flaws of how they are inhabited. They will have flaws in terms of how it's positioned. So long before you think of how you want to live and where you want to live, you must think about the broader design. And for me, similarly, this applies to research. Before I think how I'm going to do the research, I must understand why I want to do the research. What is the broader thinking around that? And I do hope that we can, as supervisors, support each other more in articulating the nuances between design. And as Bobby, we get, Bobby has put it out as a 7-step process where it is about, assessing the relevant existence of knowledge on the phenomenon that student wants to do, formalizing of concepts or propositions, formalizing an idea or hypotheses, designing the research methodology to test those, then the acquisition of meaningful data, the analysis and evaluation of the data, and the proposal for an explanation of the phenomenon, and a statement of new problems raised by the research. Those are very specific 7 steps, which we see the likes of Babi and Sigmund et al. Have defined. But I really want to call that we should make more about research design as opposed to research methodology. But that brings me to the third and the last section. Rian, if we can go to the next question. Just go to the questions. The last question is, what informs the student's choice towards a specific research methodology or a combination of methodologies? Now, for the sake of time, I'm not sure we're going to have time to attend to that, so I'm not going to let us break away in rooms, but I just want to get some comments from the floor. What informs a student's choice towards a specific research method or methodology? Any comments?
Yes, welcome. You've got a note that add to the chat discussion there. Welcome. We can, if you unmute yourself.
Thank you. I think what informs a student choice towards a specific research method or methodologies should be your paradigm that you're using, and the assumptions or philosophical assumptions, the ontological, the epistemology, etc. Those should inform the methodology that the student is now going to adopt moving forward. But also in relation to the research, the nature of the research, and what the student intends to achieve from that research. So I'm talking about the questions or the hypothesis, if there's any of that, informing what kind of methodology the student is going to come up with. Obviously, if it's dealing with the research such as explanatory, for example, maybe the student would then now need to look into quantitative. If it is about descriptive, or I might have misplaced, I might have changed the, I might have used the wrong term, explanatory and descriptive, then that will be now for qualitative. Exploratory, then that will be for quantitative. That's just how I sometimes see some of the students come up with their methodologies.
Okay, thanks for that, welcome. I appreciate it. I see some of the comments and I want to ask a question in this regard. So a number of you say, well, the research problem will inform the choice of research methodology. So let me put it this way. So let's make a hypothetical problem. The problem is the problem is that there seems to be challenges in marketing South Africa to Africa. We want to understand how do we need to address or revisit marketing South Africa to Africa. So what will the methodology, how will that inform the methodology? Will it be qualitative? Will it be quantitative? In qualitative, will we think of it as an interactive or non-interactive engagement? Will it be mixed method? Will it be action research? Will it be integral research? And we can add to the list of methodologies. I want to make the comment, I think it can be any and all of the above. Because depending on how we systemically or systematically look at that problem, I may see it as a great opportunity to look at it from an integral research methodology. Whereas Decent may look at it and say, well, I think this is a great opportunity to look at it as an interactive, qualitative methodology. Or some people may think, well, it can be a great quantitative study if we look at existing paradigms on marketing, one community to a broader community, especially from a European point of view. If I think of marketing, there's a great tendency to look at it as a very quantitative methodological engagement. So the question around methodology is a tricky one. It's a very tricky one, and I'm not sure it is as clear-cut as we often want to think. I find that, that we may sometimes as supervisors say, well, if you work in this kind of domain of problems, well, you'll have to go quantitative. If you want to work in this domain, you have to go qualitative. My question to us and to myself often is that so simple? And maybe I need some insights from colleagues here and say, how do you really decide on that methodology? Harvey, maybe if we could take some questions on this.
Yeah, I'm going to allow one question because we only have 4 minutes before the next session starts, unfortunately. And I saw, Mark, you had your hand up for quite a while. Dr. Mark Murray.
Well, I just thought on that research problem of South Africa being marketed into Africa, that research problem needs to be restated because I think it's a matter of perspective. South Africa has always been part of Africa for a very long time, even before it was South Africa. And so I think we would need to reconceptualize that particular research problem to actually get the research design going. Thank you. That's my comment.
Thank you, Mark. And I see there's quite a lot of I don't want to say mixed method, but mixed suggestions and preferences in the chat. I think the last one, Leona makes the point, if you go back to your ontological and epistemology paradigms, that do have the influence. Very true.
So I think, Javier, what I want to state here, and it's very important what the colleagues' comments are, it almost confirms the complexity about what methodology will be used. And I almost just want to close there and say, I think we should acknowledge methodology is a much more complicated and complex matter than what we make it out to be. And it's got far-reaching implications for what we will ultimately find in our research. And that we should all be sensitive, including myself, to not just almost impose a methodology onto a research problem or a research process, but that we must be very cautious in how we select that methodological option to really make sure that we achieve the aim of the research. But thank you for the opportunity for sharing these views. We will make more details available if people want to see more of it, but thanks for the opportunity, Javier.
Thank you, Benny. And also to everybody that commented and raised the expressions, it's much appreciated. To Prof Anderson, thank you for your reflections and your insights and stretching our minds. You really did that. And, I think in many ways, you not only challenged us, but through teasing us on these aspects, you actually make us think. And like you say, this is a complex phenomenon and we'll need to constantly revisit that. And I think this is a discussion that probably will not be dusted, if ever. And so we may continue along those paths. Thank you very much, and all the questions as well. Then the last session, and we're on time, is the getting to a close now on the examination process that will take us all the way up till 10 to 11. And it's a privilege to welcome back Professor Ralph Hamann. Ralph did a session yesterday afternoon. And for those that were not here, a quick overview, introduction of Ralph. Ralph is at the UCT Graduate School, University of Cape Town, and he focused on strategy, sustainability, collaborative governance, and social entrepreneurship in innovation. And he's a rated international acclaimed researcher by the NRF and published in highly ranked journals such as Journal of Business Venturing and the Journal of Management Studies. And Ralph have many hats that you wear, and amongst those are his role as the editor, executive editor of the Environment of Science and Policy for Sustainable Development. He's also co-founder of the African leg of embedding project of the South African Food Lab, as an award-winning initiative where it bridges this gap between research and practice. And more recently, Ralph being a visiting professor at the Engineering Entrepreneurship School at the Brown University in the USA, and he's also a fellow at the Institut for Mittelstandsforschung in Germany. And you can look at his profile. And Ralph will close the discussion today where we're going to look at examination process and requirements, looking at the end after we supervise and how the standards being enforced from the external or amongst peers on this specific topic. So Ralph, you've got 50 minutes, including the last 10 minutes for Q&A. I will monitor the chat, and like yesterday, I think you appreciate if I stop you and there's a question if you missed the chat. Thank you, Ralph. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, HB. Appreciate this opportunity again to be part of this wonderful discussion. And especially also for all the participants and the interesting questions and comments that have been posed in the chat. And as HB said, please continue to do that, and hopefully we can address them as we go along. As was the case yesterday, hopefully I can build on some of the stuff that's been said in the previous two sessions. I mean, before I go on, there was quite a bit of conversation in the last 20 minutes on when qualitative, when quantitative, when mixed methods. There are no hard and fast rules necessary, but there are some useful considerations. And one of the articles that has helped me, and we also use it in our PhD program, is the Edmondson and McMahon 2007. And I put the reference into the chat. I just wanted to mention that. That is one way. Basically, the suggestion is to look at the maturity of the field or the conversation that you want to join, and the more nascent that conversation, the more likely an inductive qualitative project is amenable, and the more mature that conversation, the more material you have, conceptual material you have to develop hypotheses for a deductive hypothesis testing, theory testing kind of approach. And if it's somewhere in between, then they say then you could use something like a mixed methods approach. There's also a chapter that is recently been published that we wrote, Professor Rom from UNISA and I, on mixed methods. Those of you that are interested are welcome to get in touch. I can send it through to you, or maybe if I remember, I can put the reference into the chat. And in that article, actually, Prof Rom and I, we have a dialogue where we also try to foreground some of the different paradigmatic assumptions that we have in our research. And I think that dialogue is actually quite a nice different format for an article or chapter in this case. Anyway, let me share the slides on the topic that was suggested to me today. And can you maybe just confirm that the slides are up?
Yes, we can see them, Ralph. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so the topic I want to chat to you in the next 45 minutes or so is your role as supervisor in guiding your student through the examination process. Some of the things that I'm going to say are salient also as to us as examiners, right? Because in some ways, the two sides of the coin is the student and the supervisor trying to prepare something for examination, and on the other hand, of course, the examiner. But the focus is largely on the student and supervisor side in this talk, and the implications are, I think I'll let you try to pull them out as an examiner. But feel free to ask questions that focus on your possible role as examiners, which I think most of you in the room are also doing that. And it's very important, I think, right? It's important to be examining in order to anticipate what examiners want. So that you actually learn, you can help guide the student in anticipating those expectations. So I'm actually going to have just 3 key points, but each of them I think requires a little bit of substantiation. So the first one is that as a supervisor, your role is to clarify for the student, help the student understand the examiner's expectations. And then, of course, the whole supervision process is all about making sure that the output at the end of the day, the document that the student develops, a thesis or a research report in the MBA case, fulfills those expectations. Right? So I don't want to, this clearly builds on a lot of the stuff that's been said in the last few days. I'm not going to, repeat that material all that much. Yesterday, Mia's, for instance, talked about the requirements of a PhD. What does it mean to make a scholarly contribution? So on, I spoke about that in that session later in the evening yesterday as well. But to summarize, a PhD must make a contribution to scholarship. And I made the argument that essentially that means it's a theoretical contribution. And I suggested yesterday that a rule of thumb is, could the key arguments in this thesis be published in the scholarly peer-reviewed literature? And so if I'm working with my student, that has kind of 2 implications. One is it needs to fulfill those expectations of what might pass through a rigorous peer review process. The other implication is also very important, and this is something I spoke about yesterday, is that you can be published in different kind of domains or kinds of journals, right? So there is no such thing as a single category of scholarly journal. You could aspire to publish in a global journal. Some are more theoretically focused, some are more pragmatically or practically or policy focused. Right? So I mentioned a couple of examples yesterday. And, on the one hand, I think we can say that some of those choices can be made without concern about, some of these journals being better or worse. On the other hand, some are definitely more demanding than others. And so it also depends on where your student wants to go after the PhD, right? If she wants to find a job, be able to find a job in a business school in other parts of the world, you need to anticipate that they have pretty demanding requirements as far as journal papers go. If she wants to have a good job, a decent school in the US or Canada or Europe, you need to know that you probably want to publish in one of about 5 or 6 key journals, and you need to, the whole PhD basically becomes oriented towards those journals. Broadly speaking, you could say maybe the FT50, it needs to be in the FT50, right? Of course, if your student says, you know what, I'm not going to be an academic, or I'm going to be a different kind of academic, I'm going to be more practically oriented, then some of the policy journals, if it's, if the career is very focused on a maybe South African context, then you could say, well, okay, maybe you can go for South African or Southern African journals. But those decisions are very important, and that actually, this isn't something you discuss with the student in year 3 or year 4. This is what you discuss with the student on day 1 of the PhD, because everything in the PhD is oriented to that outcome. And so what that means is that your student from day 1 needs to know that who her or his key audience is. And for the PhD, it's 3 examiners. So she or he needs to have a sense of what kind of people these examiners are and what they're looking for. And then chances are, if you are aiming for a good journal, those examiners need to be in some ways representative of what's required in those good journals. Okay, so that's a pretty hard, tough call and a tough kind of agenda. And so it's not, as I say, it's something that has to be on the plan, part of the plan from the very beginning of the PhD journey. For a master's, of course, it's a little bit different. As we discussed, the point there is to demonstrate mastery in applying scholarship to a practical problem. You don't actually have to contribute to scholarship per se. And the key requirement there is, will this help a practitioner make decisions? So I think I'm gonna speak mostly with kind of a PhD in mind, although a lot of this does filter down in a kind of adapted way for a master's. We've got workers in the building and they are working on the roof here. I'm just going to tell them to be quiet for half an hour. Can you just hold on for a second?
Just bear with us for a moment. In the meantime, you're welcome to post a chat there in the chat box. When Rolf is back, we can flag it to him.
Sorry about that. I had to just tell them to move somewhere else. All right, so I hope that makes sense and that's clear enough. So
all good.
Are we okay to continue?
Yes, please do, Rolf. Thank you.
So one of the things that is of course also very important is not just the content of the thesis and is it making a contribution, as I've just discussed, but the structuring is really important. And sometimes when I examine theses, it's like, well, this was interesting work, but it's just the argument isn't brought across, right? So I recommend a structure to my students that is basically in line with these 7 points here. The ordering is not necessarily very, very specific like this, so I suppose it could go, in slightly different ordering. But in my view, this ordering makes sense, right? So if I look at the introduction, which is normally the first few pages in a thesis, I can get a very quick sense of how, number one, what the argument is in this thesis. Number two, how well the argument has been structured, right? So I think an introduction, and in some ways this also pertains to the abstract, should do the following things. It should identify the issue that's that we are interested in, or the domain, the context. And then it should tell us what we know from the theoretical or scholarly conversation that is salient or pertinent to this issue. So points 1 and 2 can be, sometimes theses go straight into the theory, and then the practical kind of context is implicated in that. But I think, especially in South Africa, where we have a strong practical orientation to a lot of our scholarship, and for most of our students have a strong practical orientation, I find it's useful to explicate that. And basically I say to students, for point 1, imagine you're a journalist. Tell us the what, the why, the how, the who, and the when, and then of the issue that you're kind of dealing with. And then in the next paragraph, you can tell us tell us what the home is for this thesis. What is the scholarly home in this work? And we want to hear what, in a very concise way, in the introduction, what we know about this issue and also what we don't know. Right? This is the gap or problem in the literature. We spoke about that yesterday. That's the key outcome of the lit review. And this gap or problem in the literature then gives rise to a clear and focused research question. The methods is in essence, or the research design and the methods are in essence your practical plan of answering the research question. And the key aspects there is what's the sample, so what's the design, what's the sample, what's data collection, and what's the data analysis approach. Then we want to have a paragraph on the findings and a paragraph on the contributions to theory, and then perhaps a separate paragraph on the contributions to practice. If any of these things are missing, then it doesn't provide a full picture. And by the way, if you look at many articles, if you look at AMJ articles, for example, you can often recognize in the introduction, they're generally 6 or 7 paragraphs, and they're quite kind of often they have a pattern that is a little bit like this. So that's the first role objective for you as a supervisor, is to help the student understand what's expected and develop a product that fulfills those expectations. The second point, and I think what I'll do is I'll go through the 3 points and then we can open up for discussion unless there are some urgent questions of clarity and so on. The second task that you have as a supervisor is to carefully and diligently nominate examiners. And this depends a little bit on the different universities have different rules, but I'm going to mention the UCT rules, but then I'll also I'll make some more general kind of remarks about that. So at UCT, there's essentially 2 criteria that we have to fulfill. You need to find examiners that, and this is for PhDs, right? They need to have published on themes linked to the thesis. So it's not good enough to have somebody, okay, so here's a thesis on, strategic responses to crises in the times of COVID-19, right? And then it's not good enough for the for someone to just be broadly speaking in strategy. You want someone who has actually published on strategy, and ideally something that also uses some of the related theories and or methodologies. The other criterion is that there should be 2 of the 3 examiners should be what they call international. It's a slightly odd thing because it's not always clearly defined, but someone working in a university outside South Africa who is has shown a capability to publish in international journals. I think the point there is to avoid having parochial kind of scholarly conversations, because this is supposed to be a contribution to knowledge, and knowledge I think is seen as at a kind of a global level. At the same time, clearly it's relevant that we have local contextual relevance and specificity and sensitivity that is demonstrated in the thesis. So, it's basically kind of balancing the need to contribute to a global conversation, but also responding to local needs and priorities and contexts. So the key one of the ways to really think about this especially for a PhD, is that the examiner should be part of the scholarly conversation that the thesis is trying to be part of. So this was the key point we discussed yesterday. And so one of the ways that I think about identifying examiners is that if the thesis is well written, the first 3 pages of the thesis should cite some key authors and key papers that provide that conceptual foundation for the argument, for the thesis. And chances are that some of those authors would be good examiners. So, I mean, I recognize that that's not always an easy thing to do because those authors are often quite high profile academics. They have fairly high expectations and standards. And it's not always easy to, and they're very busy, right? So it's not always easy to get hold of them. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, which is how this relates to your role as a supervisor in developing relationships with relevant academic scholars. So in the case of a master's, essentially speaking, the same principles apply, but of course the kind of expectations or demands are not as significant or demanding. The examiners only need a corresponding degree, right? So if it's an MPhil, they need an MPhil. If it's an MBA, I think they do need a full master's. It's not enough to have an MBA, although I think sometimes there's a bit of a gray area there. You know, it depends if they have strong practical background. Then that will also stand in their favor. But the basic principle is similar, right? You want examiners that know about the topic, that have ideally written about the topic, and that are willing and able to give critical feedback on the piece of work. So I clearly, you know, you want to nominate examiners, and so I don't know the details of how your universities handle this. In our system, and in fact, in many universities, also overseas, as a supervisor, you can nominate, and then you have normally you have a committee that then approves those nominees. But especially in a PhD, but even to some extent a master's, you know, those committees take some convincing. Their job is to maintain high standards for the university, and so they will avoid you having these kind of sweetheart reports that are written by examiners, right? So the committee's job, and some of you might be on these committees, is to really demand and execute high criteria and requirements for examiners. And so what you need to do as a supervisor, you need to actually put quite a bit of work into this to make sure that your nominees get accepted. So first, clearly you need to identify people that will fulfill the university's requirements. But even there, you know, it's actually interesting. My experience is that, especially if there's a bit of a gray area, you know, there's quite a bit you should try to do to, in some ways, almost sell your nominees to highlight their strengths in order that the chair of the committee and then the committee itself, you know, agrees basically with you that these examiners will be appropriate. The second point, again, this might be different in different systems, but in our system, you as a nominator, as a supervisor, you get to check with the people, the nominees, whether they would be willing to do this. And clearly it would help if they agree to do it, because that means that the committee doesn't have to go through that whole process, the administrative process of contacting people and getting them to agree. And also, this is where relationships are really, really important. So the key, I think one of the key points I want to make with your role as a supervisor is that all of this means that you need to develop and foster a network of colleagues whom you can call on to examine your students. And depending, you know, which kind of space you are playing in, whether it's mostly in the South African kind of scholarship space or other, kind of, if you want to play more globally, let's say, that decides what kind of networks you want to foster, what kind of conferences you go to, right? Things have become a little bit more difficult now with COVID-19. You don't have those personal opportunities to speak face to face, but you do have opportunities quite a lot to have digital conferences, right? So online platforms. So I really recommend you make use of that. In some ways, that has made things easier and cheaper for you. So you can join the Academy of Management meeting from the comfort of your home. You are still paying your $200 entrance fee for the conference, which is not very cheap, but at least you're saving 30,000 Rand of airline costs and hotel costs, right? But there you can interact with a lot of people and try to find people that will be possible examiners. So in fact, also in my email program, I have a little folder where I think I call it possible examiners or something like that, right? And whenever I have an interaction with someone where I think, hang on, this person could come in handy at some point, I just put that email there. And then, sometimes when I'm really not sure who can examine my students, I troll through that list. So really, the networking and relationship building is a very important part of your supervisory responsibilities and job, really, I think. So as I mentioned, you want to carefully motivate for your nominees so that the committee can appreciate their relevance and also their standing in the field. You want to explain that standing. You want to mention relevant publications. So I'm just going to show one or two examples of recent ones where I was trying to sell nominees to the committee. This is the form we have to fill out at UCT. This is just the first page of about 4 pages. But here is one of the nominees, and this is an example where there's absolutely no challenge for me as nominator. This is a top-notch scholar. He's published in all the big journals, AMJ, SQ, etc., and it's very salient to this thesis. And basically here, this was easy to nominate, although it's not that easy to get someone like this to agree. And so what really helps, of course, is again the relationships. So one of my co-supervisors knew this person personally. And the other thing that helps is to have a strong thesis, right? So what I do is I send the abstract to somebody that I'm approaching to act as examiners. And that abstract just needs to be really strong, because the examiner is going to look at that abstract and say, do I want to read this thesis? And if it's full of spelling mistakes and it doesn't have a good structure and doesn't really have a clear argument, then the examiner is going to say, you know what, I've got better things to do with my time. Let me say politely decline, basically. So we got lucky here. This is like one of the key scholars in the field for this particular thesis. Here's another example. So this is a more junior scholar, and here I had to work a bit harder as a supervisor to really kind of push this through. So often also you need to, I think, be quite strategic. If you have 3 examiners, I generally try to have at least one very well-established scholar who's very well published and so on, and then you can have somebody who is a little bit more emergent, like Garima here, who's a younger scholar, but although she's also quite well published already. And then you can also have a third examiner, perhaps from a South African university or something like that. So in other words, you can spread your kind of nominees like that, and as the committee will then be more likely to accept the kind of 3 as a whole kind of thing, as a group. Okay, so much on the nominating examiners. The third key job that you have as supervisor is you want to help the student effectively respond to examiners' reports. And so again, this has a little bit of a variety in terms of different organizations. I'm just going to quickly mention what, in essence, what we expect examiners to do in our system, especially from a PhD point of view. And so we want them to identify both strengths and weaknesses. I think this is pretty generic, and to evaluate the thesis along the lines of generally one of three categories. UCT, in fact, has just added a fourth one to make a kind of intermediary. Basically, point B has been divided into two, but in essence, it's the same thing that you encounter in a journal review process. You can have accept with no revisions, which is incredibly rare, especially in a PhD. And then what we basically are hoping for is, in a journal context, it would be a revise and resubmit, right? It's specific revisions needed. And this is to be evaluated by the supervisor. And they're basically, you know, and I haven't spoken to this, but well, I will speak to this. That the job then for you becomes, as a supervisor, to help the student write, you know, kind of diligent responses to the examiner comments. And then, of course, C is that more serious changes need to be made, and then it goes back to the examiner. Where things get complicated, especially if the thesis isn't up to scratch, right? And sometimes you can be a fantastic supervisor, and sometimes the student just doesn't come to the party, and it's just the way it is. That thesis isn't all that great. You know, to some extent, you can try to squeeze it through by finding, you know, friendly examiners. But again, the committee will likely make that your job pretty difficult in doing that. And so chances are the examiners are just going to say, this just isn't good enough. In the first examination, C would be the way to go. And then in the second examination, if it still isn't good enough, then there's a D option, which is fail. And unfortunately, it does happen, right? People work for 4 or 5 years and then they get a fail. And it's a very sad outcome, something, of course, that we work very hard to avoid. And, you know, of course, recruitment of students is a big part of this. You need to have a sense of whether they're going to make it through the process. But this is the essential kind of structuring of the kinds of comments and evaluations that are expected from an examiner. And so what it means for you as a supervisor is, once those reviews come in, your job is to help the student develop a capacity for what I call reflective diligence in responding to feedback, an ability to not have this gut reaction, which a lot of us, and I think we always will have, this kind of initial knee-jerk reaction, which is this examiner or this reviewer doesn't know what he's talking about. And it just takes a bit of time to say, okay, let me put these comments away and then come back to them after I've calmed down a little bit, and then basically to understand that there's some generative insight in almost all cases. I must be honest, sometimes reviewers or examiners just misunderstood something, or that they're, you know, basically on a tangent. They don't, and sometimes they actually don't know what they're talking about, right? So that does happen. But almost, I think part of the job as a supervisor is to help the student develop that capacity to see what is valuable, even in feedback that is very uncomfortable to see. So just to mix it up a little bit, I wanna just have a quick question. You can put your answer in the chat, or you can shout it out with the microphone. When does this start? When, as a supervisor, do you start help with to develop that capacity in a student in responding to feedback?
So there's a question from Ralph. Anybody that want to raise their hand or put something in the chat? Day one is the response from Suzette.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. Day one is when we inculcate in the student, right, the ability to respond to examiners. So right from the beginning of the student's journey. And so why? Because the entire PhD from day one, thank you, Suzette, is a really big part of that is to learn to respond constructively, creatively, without too much defensiveness to feedback, right? I mean, the feedback is the essence of what we do as supervisors. And yes, as supervisors, we also need to learn to give feedback so that's more likely to be constructive and more likely to foster kind of insight in the student, responsiveness from the student. But at the same time, we as scholars and as students, we need to learn how to do that. And it's feedback from the supervisor, but it's also feedback from peers, right? So we encourage all our students to also create little, kind of groups, peer feedback groups where they read each other's work. So we have workshops where we also facilitate that kind of thing. At the end of year one, they need to formally present their proposal, and then they need to get feedback on that proposal from a panel. And those are all exercises. Yes, it's meant to improve the proposals and the thesis, but those exercises at the same time are all about fostering the scholarly ability to handle feedback. Something I think we all struggle with, and it's just one of those things we need to help.
Sorry, Ralph, can I maybe just make a short contribution myself here? What I always, my preference is to, as you say, from day one, sooner than later, but to immediately when those reports are available to the supervisor, make contact with the student, because I think as supervisors, we understand that it's critical, but students sometimes interpret it as negatively and they almost lose faith and trust in the process. So if you can just sit them down and digest for them the main drifts and themes in a report, and calm them down and they take it forward, I found that's really beneficial to students.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it also helps to know the student a little bit. In a PhD, you would have worked with her or him for 3-4 years or so, so you kind of have a sense. I mean, ideally, the student would have developed that capacity in those 3 or 4 years that you don't need to do this hand-holding, right? That you just send the comment with the reviews and the student will know how to handle it. Sometimes that's, if you know that, and sometimes it's also circumstances, if she or he's been going through a rough time, family issues or whatever, then, you need to be, that's part of the supervisor's job, is to know what's going on in the life of the student so that you can anticipate a little bit ways of cushion, especially if it's very critical feedback, right? So if there's a very critical feedback, then I need to think about how is this going to come across without being devastating to the student. I mean, so thanks for that comment. Let me continue, and thank you for comments and questions in the chat. I'm not going to respond to them right now. Let's try to wrap up the inputs, and then we have a conversation at the end. And if I don't pick up on it afterwards, please just repeat it and just mention it in the conversation through you.
100%, Ralph. Thank you.
So one of the things that is necessary, and I think this is another important kind of implication of all this, is as supervisor, we are giving critical feedback to our students. I think it is only fair, and I think it's necessary, that we expose ourselves to critical feedback. That provides us with legitimacy, right? I don't think it's fair to be critical of students if we are not opening ourselves up to criticism. At the same time, what it does, it helps us think about number one, our own work, and our methodological assumptions, and our the advice that we give to students and so on. We learn through that feedback, but we also learn about receiving feedback. And so if we know what it's like to get really critical feedback in really demanding journals, we have a kind of a posture that can help us help the student deal with feedback. And I think supervision, a little bit like parenting, although, don't ask me for parenting advice because I'm definitely not going to offer it. It is a little bit like that. Sometimes it's more about what you do or what kind of behaviors you model rather than what you say, right? So if you say to the student, you need to be gracious when you receive feedback, but then you get critical feedback from journal reviews and you kind of blow your top and you swear at write emails with lots of swear words, then that the student doesn't really get the message. So I think it is quite important for us as supervisors to really put ourselves out there, to be submitting to journals, to be submitting to demanding journals, so that we get the kind of experiences that the students will go through when they submit to examiners. All right, so one of the reasons is that actually it helps to consider the examination process in a similar kind of vein as a journal review process, and it is very similar. And so the first implication is, as I've been saying, is to help the student develop the capacity, respectful, gracious, and independently minded responses, right? Because that's what the student needs to do, especially if it's a B or a C. The revision needs to be done to the thesis, but there needs to be a schedule of corrections or some kind of response letter to the examiners that says, here are your comments, and here are my responses to those comments, right? So the thing that's also relevant here is the emotional response. And so, as I was trying to say, that we all struggle with tough feedback. So part of the job for the supervisor is to help the student grapple with some of those emotions. And the practicalities of this is that each examiner comment requires a careful response, describing changes made or reasons for no changes. So I think the university generally has those guidelines that they explicate for students, that you as a supervisor also clearly, just need to make sure the student understands them. But one of the other implications I didn't put onto the slide of the journal review process is, as I said, I think it really helps for you to go through that process so you know what it's like. And number two, if you go through that process, you can actually share with your students the submission that you submit, the responses you get from reviewers, and then the response that you write in your response letter to the editor and the reviewers, right? And so sometimes those are really quite substantive documents. I mean, I submitted one, a second revision a couple of days ago, and the response letter was 25 pages, where each comment got like a solid paragraph where I respond to the reviews of the reviewers. And I, in our PhD workshop, generally speaking, in our first year program, we try to have a session where we go through the revision process in the demanding journal, which quite often can have 3 or 4 rounds, and each time the paper gets written almost entirely from scratch. And each time there's a 20-page response letter to the editor and the reviewers. And I think students need to see that, because they see that also us as supervisors, we are fighting a similar battle and grappling with similar challenges as they are in the process of getting their thesis submitted. The nice thing is that it's much easier to get your PhD thesis examined than to get into a tough journal. And so if you help them think about what it takes to get into a tough journal, getting through the examination process should be kind of an easier task. So one of the things you need to do is to help your students write this response schedule. We call it at UCT, we call it a schedule of corrections. And generally speaking, it's a table where you have one column with the comments from the examiners, and then a second column where the student says, okay, thank you, this is what I think about your comment, and this is what I did in response, right? And here's an example of a draft schedule of corrections of one of my students. This was about 8 or so pages long, and this is just the first page. On the left-hand side, she kind of repeated the key comments from some of the reviewers, each of the 3 reviewers, and then she wrote her response. And part of my job is to, critically review her responses. And sometimes I said, yes, this is great. Other times I said, hang on, this isn't clear to me. Why did you do this? What about other things? And then, of course, particular emphasis needs to be put on those review comments that are possible make or break for the thesis, right? So Franzel talked about paradigms yesterday. It doesn't often happen, but I had a student a couple of years ago where one of the examiners said that there's dissonance or incoherence between different parts of the thesis in terms of paradigms. And then, my student and I had to really think quite carefully about how to defend against that criticism. We had to go back to some of the paradigmatic literature and some of the root literature of that thesis to see what are some of the paradigmatic assumptions in that root literature. and then we could kind of substantiate that we had this kind of mixed methods approach. Anyway, so this does take quite a bit of attention, and clearly a supervisor's help is often needed here, because you are the interface between a critical examiner and the student and what she or he is trying to pass. So these are the 3 points, and I think it's useful to have done wrap up the presentation so that we have at least 10-15 minutes for some discussion. And I do see quite a few comments and questions in the chat, so I think it's useful to open it up a little bit. So these are the 3 points I was trying to make, and yeah, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Ralph. Anybody that want to raise a hand? I think, Ralph, you will see there's some questions starting there from about 11:37. But is there any hands if somebody want to ask a question in person? Otherwise, Ralph can maybe take those questions in the site and respond to them. I think there's quite a lot of practical and real reality questions. I see there's a question hand being raised from Slian Pillay. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Prof. I just want to just mention this, that you either accept it or not, Prof Ralph Hamann, that I find this external examiners and conforming to them, also the role of a supervisor as well. It's like stifling the creativity of the student. And it even sometimes stifles the extent of the creativity of the supervisor. It's like a conditioning process that there is a product at the end. It's like a very highly positivist approach to getting things done. But I suppose on this planet, it's a way of getting research committed and communicated and getting students to pass. What's your comment on this? I hope you don't mind me raising this point. It's just my feeling.
So I'm not exactly sure I understand what your concern is. I mean, there is, yesterday, I don't know if we were part of that conversation yesterday, one of the jobs as a supervisor is to help your student to straddle a very profound tension in a scholarly research process. One is to understand that research is bound by parameters of convention. And those parameters of convention have to do with theoretical assumptions in terms of the body of work that you want to participate in, as well as methodological conventions. On the other hand, there is a need for novelty, innovation, and creativity. And those, so you kind of, at the same time, you're trying to understand what does it take to act within the bounds of scholarly convention, and simultaneously, you're trying to push those boundaries. And so actually one of the things that I think is part of our job as supervisors is to know, so you want to push those boundaries sufficiently so that you make a contribution, because if there's no pushing of boundaries, the examiners are going to say this is no scholarly contribution. Do this again, or do this differently. On the other hand, if you push those boundaries too strong, then people are going to say this is absurd. You're kind of, and you're going to struggle to substantiate and convince a critical reader. And so that's part of your job as a supervisor, is to say, where is that magical in-between space where you're pushing boundaries strong enough to be making a contribution, and more than just an incremental contribution, right? So the more ambitious you are as a scholar, the more you want to push those boundaries. But not too much, so that you basically lose the reader. The reader doesn't follow each step of your argument, and that's basically part of good argumentation. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that it relates to what I was saying about nominating the right examiners, and you need to also guide your committee in this. It is very important that you don't get a positivist examiner if you have a kind of a very post-structural or very interpretivist thesis. Then the examiner is going to come at this with a different paradigmatic approach, and especially if it's an examiner that's not very circumspect, right, that doesn't have a lot of experience, then she or he's going to see the world in a particular way and is not going to be able to say, okay, my research approach is positivist, but this approach here is a different one. Let's try to understand, let's try to examine this thesis on the grounds that have been explicated by the student. Not all examiners are able to do that. You want to avoid examiners that have a very different targeted, kind of approach to research, that are simultaneously unable to broaden their view of what is legitimate and valid research. And that's part of your role as a supervisor. You make sure you steer clear from that kind of examiner. And your university needs to help you with that.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf. And then just looking at the questions, there's a few practical questions. How long should the examiner be given? What are the criteria? That all depends what rubric or criteria the institution are providing to the examiners. So I think there are some general rules of thumb, but it all depends from different institutions. What do you do if examiners are giving you meaningless comments and if the supervisor can't help practical things? And I think you addressed that as well. And there's a few interesting points, but maybe you can respond to that one, Rolf.
Yeah. Before you make the list too long, my memory is not very good, so I need to just hold one or two at the same time. There's an ongoing thing about examination rubrics, and my approach, especially in a PhD, has been to say rubrics can be problematic because they kind of create these templates, and let's bear in mind that a PhD is trying to push boundaries of knowledge. You don't have templates for that kind of thing, right? And yes, there are conventions in terms of structure and so on, but at this level, where you are at the boundaries of knowledge in a particular field, those things should be implicit. Those things should be known. So both the student and the supervisor and the committee and the examiners should know what needs to go in a good thesis. And the key test is a very simple one. Is this a contribution to knowledge? And I interpreted that from a practical point of view. Is this going to get into the journal that you're targeting? And you signal the journal that you want to target in your first 3 pages, because that's the conversation you're joining, right? And those are the assumptions and premises and kind of criteria that the examiner should also use in saying, is this kind of work going to get into those kinds of journals? And that's why it's important to have, to try at least to get examiners that know what it's like to get into journals like this. Now, and I understand that that's not always possible, right? Not everyone, has had a chance to do that. But I think it's part of our role to always keep pushing ourselves to get into decent journals, because then we are better supervisors, and I think we are better examiners. And the thing about rubrics is different in an MBA. In an MBA, in our system, at the GSB, some years ago, one of my colleagues has put a lot of effort into creating a rubric. MBA students are famous for wanting very clear guidelines for what needs to go in and go out of a document. It's very difficult to push back against that. In an MBA, it's different. We do have a 2-page table that says, do this, do that, and this, and one for quantitative, one for qualitative. One for case studies, teaching case studies. And I think that rubric actually helps everyone, the student, the supervisor, and the examiner. So I think there is a space for rubrics. Personally, I don't think there's really a space for a rubric at a PhD level, but there is for MBAs. That's just my personal take. I'm not too worried about it. If someone does give me a template for a rubric for a PhD, I look at it, but generally it doesn't tell me anything that's, anything new. There was some comments about should the examiner provide suggestions for improvement of the work or not? I'm not too sure, Michael, whether I understand that question. I mean, I think the straightforward answer to that is yes. From day one to the day this piece of work is submitted for examination, that is your job, is you're trying to suggest improvement of the work. And then when the examiner's responses come in, that is the work, is to improve the pieces as much as possible so that the examiners can be convinced that their comments have been taken seriously. So some of the other comments I think point in the direction of what do you do if the examiners are wrong-headed, if they misunderstood the thesis, if they come with a paradigmatic assumption that's inappropriate or something like that. that can be tricky. And that part of your job as a supervisor is to help the student respond politely, but decisively and independently, which means that the student needs to write in the schedule of corrections that she or he has understood the comment and taken it seriously, but has good reasons for not changing the thesis in response to that comment. And there can be different reasons for that. And sometimes, you know, the phrasing is very important. You don't want to just say, you know what, this is a stupid comment, go away. You want to say, okay, I understand this comment to mean A, B, and C. My reason for not taking this serious is, or not responding to this with changes in the thesis are X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's just because it goes beyond the scope. Sometimes my students say, you know, I'm gonna leave this. I will consider this when I revise my work for publication or submission to a journal. So there are different ways of basically saying, thank you for the comment, but no.
Thank you, Ralph. I see there's a lot of positive comments, but if I can ask that we conclude it here, we need to wrap up, and I still need to give you some pointers for future before we close. But Ralph, thank you very much. You know, I think the way you handled the topic and, you know, your reflections on the examiner reports and some of the processes gave many of us a different perspective. And, you know, it's important, like you said, that we use the examiner comments, because at the end is there to strengthen the study. And as much as it's daunting to wait for the examiner report from a supervisor's perspective, is also where we can learn a lot as supervisors and the students. So it's actually a very positive process. I've shared with everybody in the link in the chat a link for feedback again on the day. Now, as I want to conclude, and before we look into the future and answer the question, what's next, I just want to first of all say thank you to every participant and those that already had to leave and couldn't join here today, for showing up, for providing your perspective, providing your input, and here and there also commented on some of the discussions over and above the questions. By showing up, we get indication it's important. We appreciate that. And from SABSA's side, we will definitely continue having the discussions. And this is what we want to do amongst the 22 members of the members to SABSA, the business schools in there. And there you can see who we are, the 22 members. I also specifically want to then thank the presenters that provide us with the insights and, you know, taking the time to assist and facilitate these sessions from Tuesday. It was really insightful. If you go to the SABSA website, you can download most of the slides, except those that just talk to us. And then the recordings are all available, so you'll find the link there. Please do so. And then I also want to say to Rian and Alpheus and the IT team behind the scenes, you know, really appreciate your assistance here, and the facilitators echo that to me in private. Okay, but from here forward, where to go next? And I think, and discuss that, and on behalf of SABSA, we're asking you if you have any future perspectives or suggestions, or would like to get involved, or topics that you want to present, you are more than welcome to write to Anne. Her email was shared earlier in the chat there. You can also pick our details up in the business schools, the various directors, and then we will flag it to Anne. Find our details on the SABSA website. Please engage with Anne. Write a comment to you, or write to me, or anybody that you know, and say, please forward to Anne that we discuss that. And don't be shy to offer your service. Don't be shy to offer suggestions on future topics, because we want to make that on continuing debate as we go forward. And I see there was already some services offered in the chat. Thank you for that. Because at the end, you know, we want to push and deepen the discourse, and also then an invite to all the member business schools and other people that are here. If you have a specific developing workshop, please share that with us. You know, we will definitely distribute and circulate among the members, because at the end, I think in the spirit of moving forward, we must take hands on this. And as much as we have a lot of expertise in the room and in our different business schools, the more we share, the more we can gain. You can never give and with a closed hand. So please share that with us. And then lastly, back to SABSA and all the schools involved. It was for us, Vinci, a pleasure to work with you, Anne. All the organizing behind. It's always a privilege working with you, and I can't wait for the next time. But when you speak to Randall, and also discuss it with him, and when we have our next meeting, thank you to everybody that made this possible and really make it happen. And then I see there's a lot of comments coming in. And then lastly, before you sign off and show your face and wave goodbye, please complete that quick poll for us. It will take you a minute or two. We really appreciate your input. And thank you very much once again for showing up and supporting this, I think, a beautiful initiative. Thank you to Anne. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you. See the faces.
Thank you,
Good to
everyone.
see you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Enjoy the day.
And have a nice weekend.
Likewise. Thank you.
So much, everyone. We really enjoyed.
You're welcome. I'm glad. Thank you for that feedback.
Thank you, colleagues.
Quibus,
Awesome.
thank you.
Well done. Take care.
Thank you.
Quibus, thank you. Michael, thank you. Mias.
Thank you.
Zed. Peter.
Thank
We will
you.
touch base.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Andy,
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Andy, you quickly want to have a reflection while we're still here?
Stop the recording and then we can.
Yeah, we can do. And if
Don't know who else is still here.
that is